fact, several months ago, Annie Emerson asked me about the possibility of getting together to talk about the issue of the use of animals in research, the ethical and theological dimensions of that, and asked, will there ever be a time that there could be an opportunity in the parish to discuss the issue? And I said, well, actually, I've got the perfect time for that, and that's on the feast of St. Albert the Great. St. Albert was a natural scientist, one of the first natural scientists in the world, who lived in the 13th century, a fellow Dominican, but was also a great theologian. And so as a result of that, he managed to combine this intense love of God and seeing the handprint of God in all of creation, whether it was in plant life or in animal life or in human life. And so he devoted his life to a theological reflection on that. And so it seemed like tonight would be a perfect opportunity to reflect on the issue of research on animals in light of this appropriate stewardship of creation that we're supposed to have. And we decided, I had a visit with Annie and some of her friends, and so we decided on this night, and that we'd have 3 people speak tonight. The first would be Matt Rassette. Matt's a veterinarian at UW-Madison here, and he's involved with the Research Animal Resources Center, and I also had the pleasure of presiding at Matt's wedding as well, so I'm very grateful that he can be with us tonight to talk about his perspective as a veterinarian and some of the scientific aspects of it in terms of research. And then we're also pleased tonight to have Rick Marolt, who is a college instructor here in Madison and a photographer, and who has concern about the ethics of the treatment of animals. I've oftentimes seen Rick's letters to the editor in the paper, as well as op-ed pieces and things on TV. So he's a wonderful speaker, and we're very glad that he can be with us tonight to share his thoughts. And just to let you know a little bit about myself, again, for those of you who might have arrived late, my name is Father Pat Norris. I'm the pastor here at Blessed Sacrament. But besides being a pastor, I'm also the bishop's coordinator for healthcare, and for the past almost 25 years I've been teaching medical or healthcare ethics. I used to be an assistant professor in the internal medicine department at St. Louis University Medical School in St. Louis, Missouri. So I did that for 10 years before getting back into parish work. And many of these issues that we'll talk about tonight, I had to deal with when I was teaching in the Health Sciences Center. Let me just say, in terms of a sort of a pre-note before Matt offers his reflection, and what we'll do is each one will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have some time for dialogue and then reception afterwards. Let me just say that we're not going to cover all the issues associated with ethics and the use of animals. So we're taking a very narrow focus tonight just in terms of the use of animals in medical research. Now, this still means that there are a lot of other significant issues in terms of using animals for food, and a subset of that are issues of animal farming and the conditions that animals are in when they're being raised for food. There are issues associated with hunting for food or sport, issues of using animals for clothes, using animals to test for toxicity in terms of cosmetics or other types of household products. Having animals for pets actually is an ethical issue when you start to think about it. Having animals kept in zoos or being used in circuses. And those are just some of the issues. So we could be here until spring golf season, actually, if we wanted to deal with all these questions. And so we're going to just deal with a very narrow focus tonight, but just to let you know that all these issues are of concern. Let me just by point of interest, this was a question that was put to then Cardinal Ratzinger, who's now Pope Benedict, when he was addressing the subject of foie gras in terms of as a food. And he said, in terms of the way they prepare the geese in order to get this particular food. And he said this, he said, we cannot just do whatever we want with animals, certainly a sort of industrial use of creatures, so that geese are fed in such a way as to produce as large a liver as possible, or hens live so packed together that become just caricatures of birds. This degrading of living creatures to a commodity seems to me, in fact, to contradict the relationship of mutuality that comes across in the Bible. So it's just to say that there are some rather broad issues that we could be talking about tonight, but we want to just focus on the issue of animals in terms of medical research, and we won't even talk about the issue of animals in terms of medical education. That's a separate issue in terms of some of that I dealt with frequently down when I was teaching in the medical school. So we won't even deal with that. So we'll try to keep focused tonight in terms of just the issues of animals in research. So at this point, I'm just inviting Matt Rassette to come forward and to offer his thoughts. So Matt, welcome.
So I'd like to thank everyone for being here tonight, especially Father Pat for inviting me, and Mr. Marolt for joining us, and you especially for being here. I have to admit, when Father Pat first broached this idea, I was somewhat skeptical. It sounded a bit like the opening line of a bad joke, you know, something like a priest, a lab animal vet, and an animal rights advocate walking together into a bar or something like that. But after a few moments of reflection, I could see the great opportunity that Father Pat was offering me, not only to dialogue with my faith and with friends in the animal rights community, but also to engage and to share my views with you and help to answer some of the questions that you may have about this topic. Before beginning tonight, I need to make 3 quick comments. The first is that I am not speaking tonight on behalf of the university, my employer. It's just my opinions tonight, not official UW policy. Second, the things that I'm about to delve into, any one of them could be the subject of a semester-long class, let alone an hour lecture unto themselves, let alone their own part in a 10 to 15-minute talk. So I'd ask you to bear that in mind this evening as well. And finally, there's a handout at the back. I don't know if there was enough of them, but I prepared that tonight with a few suggested readings that might be of interest for you if you want to delve further into the topic. There's some websites that may be of interest there. There's also a list of acronyms that may get used tonight, just in case we don't define those as well as we need to as we go forward. And there's also a series of questions there that you can ask yourself, sort of a la Father Ron's homework, if you'd like, to help you get a better sense of where you are actually on this topic. So I hope you find those helpful. Father Pat asked me to speak to 4 fairly distinct issues tonight. First, the regulatory framework that governs the use of animals in research. Second, the importance of research involving animals for scientific advancement. Third, the tensions, if any, in being a veterinarian in this line of work. And finally, my own views on animals and research. So, let's begin tonight by examining the current regulatory framework. This principally involves 3 separate groups: the USDA, or the United States Department of Agriculture, the United States Department of Health and Human Services, and a group called ALAC, and we'll take each of those in turn. The USDA is required by the Animal Welfare Act, or the AWA, to have oversight over research that involves warm-blooded animals, with the exception of birds, most mice, and most rats. The Animal Welfare Act also charges institutions using animals in research to have what are called IACUCs, or Institutional Animal Care and Use Committees, which at a minimum must include 3 members, one of which has to be a veterinarian, and one of the other 2 members has to be a member of the community that is not affiliated with the institution doing the research. But in typical practice, these committees tend to have many more people than just 3. These committees are responsible for overseeing all aspects of the animal use program. They inspect facilities where the animals are kept and research is performed. They conduct semi-annual reviews of the animal program at that institution. And, perhaps most importantly, they review research protocols. A decision made by an IACUC to disapprove a protocol or to suspend the animal use privileges of a researcher cannot be overturned. The IACUCs provide the principal means of regulating animal research in the United States, although the USDA will also conduct unannounced inspections roughly once a year. Turning next to the Department of Health and Human Services, it has under its umbrella a group called the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, the Public Health Service, or the PHS, and a group called OLAW, or the Office of Laboratory Animal Welfare. And it's instructed by a law called the Health Research Extension Act, or the HREA, of 1985, to require any research institution that receives Department of Health and Human Services funding, i.e. NIH funding, to comply with the U.S. government principles for the care of thoroughbred animals. Institutions provide OLAW, and by extension the NIH, with what is called an assurance that explains how they will abide by these principles in the use of animals in research. The Health Research Extension Act also requires compliance with a book that's entitled The Guide for the Care and Use of Laboratory Animals, and that's cited in the handout that I provided for you. Turning next to ALAC, this is it's a kind of a long acronym that stands for the Association for the Assessment and Accreditation of Laboratory Animal Care. This is an independent group that accreditates research institutions based on their adherence to the Guide for the Care and Use of Laboratory Animals. It's intended to be a voluntary, peer-reviewed system where every 3 years accredited institutions are reviewed by experts from around the country. And the accreditation is very similar to sort of a good housekeeping seal of approval. Now, besides this framework, I think it's also important to understand a little bit about the content of the regulations themselves. And I prepared a few snippets of them. We could, like Father said, we could go on into playing golf again about all of the regulations and the details of them. But I think a few highlights might be useful. These IACUCs, or Institutional Animal Care and Use Committees, are local committees that are required to self-report problems, though they and overseen federal agencies always accept whistleblower reports as well. The regulations require proper veterinary care animals used in research. Anesthesia and analgesia are required to be provided unless the IACUC is convinced of the scientific necessity otherwise. The researcher must search for alternatives to the use of animals to answer their scientific questions, as well as a search for alternatives to painful or distressful procedures. And while there are many more such details that are specified in the regulations and in documents like the guide, these regulations, it's important to note, also give the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committees a fair bit of latitude regarding the types of research that is allowed. Moving on, the importance to scientific advancement of research using animals cannot be understated. Some research, particularly that involving the treatment of disease, which I as a veterinarian have a particular interest in, needs to take place inside the whole animal, as the interplay of biological systems is simply too complex to be modeled outside of the living animal. Further, many of the most significant discoveries in modern times, from the very concept of vaccination to the concept of neuronal plasticity, which has revolutionized the way that stroke victims are treated in our society. These things owe significant debts to animal research. And while I've heard the objection, and it's important to acknowledge, that we can never know if science would have made these discoveries without the use of animals, we also have to admit that animal research did play a very crucial and central role in these and many other discoveries that have come about, and therefore they've also played a role in the subsequent improvement in both human and animal health. Father Pat has also asked me to speak to the tension that may exist between caring for animals and caring for the science and the research as a veterinarian. This tension is not unique to laboratory animal medicine. In fact, I would argue that similar tensions exist in most all branches of the veterinary profession. Contrary to popular opinion, the dominant paradigm of the veterinary profession is that the role of the veterinarian is not to fix the animal's problems, but it's rather to fix problems that humans have with animals. Another way of getting at this point, all of the animals that are under human stewardship be they food, fiber, research, or companion, are production animals. When the animal is not producing tangible or intangible benefits that the human expects, that is when the veterinarian is usually brought into the picture. And though this is slowly changing in our society, I would argue that this paradigm still underlies the veterinary profession, and it is why the lab animal medicine is more similar than one might initially think to other forms of veterinary practice. Finally, my own views of animals used in research. My father was fond of saying that things are never as bad as they seem, and they're never as good either. And I think that this is generally true with the use of animals in research. We as a society properly limit what we would allow others to do to animals in the name of science, though we often and vigorously argue over just where to draw that proverbial line. We as a society benefit from this limitation because we have to live in the society that we create. And I would argue, our society is better when it includes mercy and compassion in its rubric of moral action, as well as scientific, medical, and technical gain. The current system of regulation allows for consideration of both in determining whether to allow a researcher to perform experiments on animals, and as such, is a decent system, in my opinion, because it places these two goods of mercy and advancement in tension with each other, and it allows for the continual balancing and adjusting of that tension as society's understanding of each evolves. Having said that, I want to try to take Father Pat's question a little bit further tonight and personalize it by asking, how does one live within and negotiate between such tensions? For me, the question of whether it is ethical to use animals in research is never a settled one. In my ideal ethical world, no animals would suffer, period. Scientists would get good research data and make advancements benefiting both humans and animals. And veterinary medicine would be focused on the animal and not what humans want from the animal. However, we do not live in that world, or at least we do not yet live in that world. Life entails some measure of suffering, research, or no. And veterinary medicine is, and probably always will be, human-centered. I believe in taking a pragmatic approach to this reality, to start from where we actually are and to work towards the ideal as well as we can. As I stated above, I believe that the current system of regulation offers the ability to move as society itself moves on this issue. And I believe that my job as a lab animal vet allows me to both advocate and care for the animal, as well as promote science that benefits both human and animal health and well-being. And while this job is often not pretty, and certainly never easy, it's nonetheless worthwhile. In sum, then, I find myself unable to answer the question, is research using animals ethical? I can only respond to it. And my response involves living a life where I use my training and my expertise to minimize the suffering of animals in research while maximizing the science. For me, it also involves never being settled on this issue, but rather being always open to honest and thoughtful criticism. And so, it is in that spirit that I yield the floor to our next speaker, Mr. Rick Marolt. In so doing, I hope that our conversations tonight will help you form your conscience on this important matter and help you shape your own response to the questions surrounding the use of animals in research. Thank you again for taking the time to be here tonight and for listening to me.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for coming out tonight. Thanks to Father Pat for organizing this event. I think it's really important for communities to hold discussions like this, and I'm glad we had a chance to. And thanks, Matt, for your thoughtfulness. I value that a lot. I've been referred to a couple times as an animal rights advocate or activist. I want to say up front, I'm not an animal rights advocate or activist. I never talk about animal rights. I find that discussing rights complicates the issue unnecessarily. My focus is simply ethics. It's the treatment. It's the choices we make and how we treat non-human animals in our society. And we can have a good discussion about that without talking about rights. So my question is, as a starting point for tonight, What is more ethical? Is it more ethical to cause suffering and death in others because we hope or expect to benefit from their suffering and death? Or is it more ethical to respect their lives and act towards them with compassion and not cause them to suffer and die? I think that's a really simple question. I think that gets at the heart of the issue, and I think it's really easy to answer. Especially when we're talking about people. I think we'd all find it very easy to answer. We don't cause suffering and death to people with the hope of benefiting from it selfishly, right? But it becomes more complicated for many people in our society when we talk about harming and killing non-human animals. Polls suggest that the majority of people in our society think that's okay. It's okay to cause suffering and death to non-human animals if we expect some selfish benefit from it. So I want to explore that with you tonight, explore that reasoning. What exactly makes experimenting in non-human animals ethical, causing their suffering and death, when it's not, conducting the same experiments on people would not be ethical? What exactly is that? I think it's important for us to wrestle with that question. So as a way of wrestling with tonight, or introducing people to the topic, I want to explore 3 or 4 arguments that people make when they want to say that experimenting with non-human animals is ethical. And I want to provoke your thinking about these arguments a little bit. One benefit that we hear, one argument that we hear, I've heard this quite a bit recently from UW-Madison, is that the benefits of experimenting on non-human animals exceed the costs. This is the basic utilitarian argument, though the utilitarian standard is actually a little higher than that. By the way, my focus is primarily on monkeys used in experiments, and so I may slip back and forth between non-human animals and monkeys. It's monkeys that I know best. So the benefits exceed the costs, is the claim. There are many problems with this argument, and we don't have enough time to get into them, but a couple points are that there just isn't much evidence that this is true. Matt presented a belief or a conclusion that experiments on non-human animals have been instrumental in many advances in human health. 2 articles in scholarly journals, peer-reviewed scientific journals, have been published in recent years that pretty much make this statement. Clinicians and the public often consider it axiomatic that animal research has contributed to the treatment of human disease, yet little evidence is available to support this view. This is from a peer-reviewed scientific journal. Okay? This isn't an animal rights activist. There's just little evidence. It's kind of a scientific dogma. It's a belief. It's something people want to cling to because as long as we can make advances in non-human animals, we get benefits for us. We cling to that. But there just isn't much evidence for it. As other facts to reinforce that point, many treatments, cures have been delayed because of over-reliance on the animal model. Polio is the most commonly cited example of that. We've been experimenting on monkeys for 25 years in HIV and AIDS research. No cures, no vaccines. Cancer survival rate. You can't imagine how many millions of animals have been using cancer research in the last 50 years. The cancer survival rate in all that time has increased 5%. Monkeys in particular are bad models of human diseases. They don't get neurological diseases like Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and yet they're used to study these diseases. Matt has made the point that we need to study the whole animal to get the benefits of research. That's why we use animals. We can't do these studies in test tubes or computer models. So we have to study the whole animal. What happens if the animal doesn't even get the disease you're studying? It doesn't make sense to study that disease in that animal. So many times the animals are not good models of the human diseases that are being studied. Food and Drug Administration has said 92% of the drugs found to be safe and effective in non-human animals are not safe and effective in people. I'm going to do that again because I have to go through this too quickly. 92% of the drugs found to be safe and effective in non-human animals are not safe and effective in people. In other words, reliance on animal testing of drugs gets it wrong 92% of the time. I could go on, but we're going to run out of time. So in any case, the argument that the benefits exceed the cost is very hard to defend. But the real problem with this argument is that that's not the standard we use when we're talking about people. We don't say, if we put people in labs and experiment on them against their will and conduct painful, injurious, fatal experiments on them and kill them and study study the tissue so we can learn more. We're going to get a lot of benefit out of it. As long as the benefits exceed the cost, that's okay. We don't do that. That's not the standard we use. And yet it's really easy for a lot of people to think, well, that's an acceptable standard to use for non-human animals. Why? I'm inviting you to think more about that. And also consider that when we're talking about costs and benefits, it's the animals who pay all the terrible costs of suffering and dying. It's we who stand to benefit. Does that look like the kind of framework we want to use for ethical decisions? It's not one that I want to use for ethical decisions. Because it looks like exploitation. It looks like cruel exploitation. One group, a powerful majority, gets benefits, while the other group suffers and dies. That's exploitation. The other kind of argument that we hear, and Matt dwelled on this a little bit, is that experiments on non-human animals are legal and highly regulated, and therefore they're okay, they're acceptable, they're ethical. The main problem with this argument is that it doesn't say anything about the ethics of the experiments themselves. It just says they're legal and they're regulated. But unethical acts have sometimes been legal, and been legal for a long time, and even been highly regulated. Slavery is the most obvious example, but consider other ones. Suppressing the right to vote of women for a long time was legal, but wasn't ethical. Black code laws in the post-Civil War South, which restricted the civil rights of freed slaves, were not ethical. But there was a lot of laws that governed that treatment. Every state in the South passed black code laws to limit the civil rights of freed slaves. Very legal, you could say ethical, because there's so, or you could say highly regulated because there's so many laws governing it, but absolutely not ethical. So this argument doesn't say anything about the ethics, and that's what we care about. Third kind of argument that we hear, and we've heard from one UW-Madison researcher in particular, who's the subject of an infamous cover story. He says we have a moral obligation to use non-human animals to benefit us, to benefit our own kind. They're not us. We need to use them to benefit us. Again, one problem with this is that using them doesn't seem to benefit us all that much, but I've covered that. The bigger problem with this argument is that it doesn't explain why the difference in species is an appropriate place to draw the line when we're talking about us and not us. Let me make this more clear. I care a lot more about the members of my family, my wife, than I care about any of you or your spouses or members of your family, right? So I could say I have a moral obligation to do whatever I can to protect my own kind, to benefit my own kind. That's my family, that's my wife. So would it be ethical for me to experiment on your kind to benefit my kind? No. Family difference is not morally significant. That's how the philosophers talk about it. So the question is species difference morally significant? Are you with me? And my question is, why would it be? Why is it that just because an individual is a member of a different species, we get to use it? We need to think about that more fundamentally. The last argument I want to go over is one that we've heard quite a bit. In the labs, the animals are treated well, and they live longer and healthier lives in the labs. This statement just isn't true, and I invite you to question it wherever you hear it. Animals suffer just by being in the labs. They suffer in unnatural conditions. They suffer being in small cages. Monkeys in particular suffer from chronic diarrhea frequently. They have mental health issues. Some people say they go insane in the labs. They move, they make the same stereotypical movements over and over again in a small space. And they're obviously not healthy. That's before they're even used in an experiment. Once they're used in an experiment, monkeys are given diseases, like immune deficiency viruses, and their health declines and they die. They're given birth defects. Their eyes are damaged, so they develop the symptoms in the form of glaucoma. Their brains are damaged. The emotional centers of their brains are almost completely destroyed in some experiments. These are things that would be would constitute criminal cruelty outside the labs. And yet we hear the monkeys are treated well, they live long, happy lives in the labs, and so it's okay to experiment on them. It's simply not true. And I didn't talk about things that go wrong unintentionally, unintentional deaths, unintentional suffering. The screws that puncture the skull and create abscesses in the brain and then kill the monkey. The monkey that's had an open skull procedure going on for hour after hour after pushing chemicals and pulling chemicals through tissue in the brain, and the attendant goes to lunch and the monkey dies. These are unintended things that happen in labs. The 3 monkeys that died from being scalded in a cage washing accident, death by scalding disinfectant. Accidents happen. These are not happy events. But again, all that isn't really the hard issue. The question here about this argument that it's okay because the monkeys live long, healthy lives and are treated well. Consider the ethical argument in there. Would we ever apply that to people? No. So why does that sound like a reasonable argument to apply to a non-human animal? So ultimately, most or all the arguments that are used to defend experimenting on non-human animals depend on the species boundary, this difference in species. And I want you to think about that more. The point is that there must be some characteristics or abilities that separate us from other animals. And it's those difference in characteristics or abilities that mean we get to treat them differently. We get to use them, we get to exploit them, right? We get to harm them and kill them for our benefit. But what exactly are those characteristics or those abilities that are morally significant? What exactly would a difference be that would justify intentional harming and killing? The first one that people think of is intelligence. Well, by all measures, we're more intelligent than monkeys and other animals, right? I bet in some ways they're more intelligent than us. But in general, our brains can do an awful lot of things that no other animal could do. So let's just agree we're more intelligent. Why is that morally significant? Well, why is the difference in intelligence a reason to exploit cruelly members of other species? And then consider what the philosophers call marginal cases. If intelligence is a criterion for deciding whom we get to harm and kill for our selfish benefit, does that mean that we get to harm and kill for our selfish benefit the least intelligent people? People who have severe cognitive impairments, or persistent vegetative states, or severely mentally retarded. Is that our criterion for when we get to experiment on others? I'm afraid I'm running out of time. I'm going to skip a little bit. I'm looking forward to Father Pat's talk. He's going to cover the Catholic view of this. I'll tell you, I was raised Catholic, not a practicing Catholic. I know that there are Catholics who think that experimenting on non-human animals is consistent with their faith, and there are Catholics who think it's inconsistent with their faith. There is a long history of opposition to research on animals, experiments on animals, within the Catholic Church. Cardinal Newman, who was just beatified recently, like 2 months ago, by the way, said, and this is mid to late 19th century, there is something so very dreadful, so satanic, in tormenting those who have never harmed us and who cannot defend themselves, who are utterly in our power, who have weapons neither of offense nor defense, that none but the very hardened persons can endure the thought of it. So I was raised Catholic, and although I'm not practicing, I am still influenced by the teachings of Christ, who taught us about compassion, humility, especially compassion for the poor, the sick, the weak, the powerless. And I try to live out those values. I think these are the kinds of values that should inform our ethical decision making. And I don't find it at all inconsistent to apply that teaching to our treatment of animals in laboratories. I think that it's completely consistent with the teachings of Christ to respect life, to have reverence for life, to feel compassion for those who suffer, to want to reduce their suffering, and not to exploit them. Because ultimately, this issue is one of social justice. We are the most powerful species on the planet. We can do what we want with members of other species. It's a lot of power that we ought to think deeply about as we use it. And if we're the most powerful and we're exploiting those who are weak, that should give us pause. Let me just end with a quote from Albert Schweitzer, who you may know. Schweitzer was a fantastically talented man in many endeavors. He was also a theologian, medical doctor, missionary, really organist, organ scholar, Bach scholar. He was amazing. Vegetarian also. He says, we must fight against the spirit of unconscious cruelty with which we treat the animals, Animals suffer as much as we do. True humanity does not allow us to impose such sufferings on them. It is our duty to make the whole world recognize it. Until we extend our circle of compassion to all living things, humanity will not find peace. Thanks for listening to all this. I look forward to Father Pat's talk and the discussion.
And Matt, for your presentations. I hope to kind of tie some things together now. I was raised Catholic as well. I think I still am last time I checked. So let me just say on this Feast of St. Albert, just to go through some pre-notes here on the nature of relationship between faith and science, which is the legacy of St. Albert the Great. And then first of all, that he believed, and it's been the Catholic tradition, that the truths of science and faith must coincide ultimately. Now there's been some unfortunate issues in the past, like the Galileo affair, although again, there was more to the politics and personality issues than actual discord between faith and science with that, if you look at the history. But that, by and large, the Church believes in the truths of science and faith have to coalesce. That you can't have one truth for science and another truth for faith. That doesn't make sense. The second, the Church believes that the scriptural moral themes, so that those things that are specific to a Catholic faith in terms of Christian faith in terms of the Bible, or Hebrew faith in terms of the Hebrew scriptures, those can ultimately be translated into the language of natural law on the level of morality. So those things that pertain to the moral law in Scripture that are there can ultimately be translated into a reasoned discourse. Third, that the Church engages the world of science and sees science as important. I'm a scientist myself. I was an analytical chemist before I became a priest. So it sees the world of science as important and promotes ethical practice in science. And finally, that it sees the importance for the necessity of sound argumentation, making sure that we are not obscuring issues by creating false dichotomies or whatever. And I want to just talk a little about some of the problematic arguments that are out there, issues, before getting into the essence of what I would say is the Catholic approach to the issue of animal research. So what are some of those arguments that are out there? Well, the first one is the technological imperative, that if we can do something, we should do something. And the Church rejects that. Ethics deals with not what can you do, but what ought you to do. So that's the first thing. Just because we can do something scientifically does not mean necessarily that we should do it. The second, that we should avoid the reality of discounting the message simply because of the messenger. So, for example, if you read some of the literature about animal rights, and here's some of the issues about extremism in terms of animal rights, advocates or activists, whatever, and therefore some people will just dismiss the arguments because of the extreme behavior of a few. Well, that doesn't make any sense from a reason standpoint. So you have to deal with the message, not necessarily what one of the messengers does. Third, we have to be careful of exaggerated scientific claims and or faulty statistics. As we know, there are lies, there are damn lies, and there are statistics in terms of how we do research, and you have to be careful with that. For example, in some of the literature on drugs that were non-problematic for animals, but problematic in humans, there's a drug called cisapride or Propulsa. It's a drug for motility, and what we found is that it was ultimately taken off the market because it was causing severe heart problems and people, even deaths, when people were taking this, even though in the animal models it was fine. Now you have to be careful with that though, because the reason why cisapride was causing the problems was not because of the drug itself, but because of drug interactions, so that this particular drug is metabolized through a particular enzyme system. And if you're taking other drugs that were also metabolized through that enzyme system, like macrolide antibiotics, like erythromycin or something like that, then it caused a toxic buildup of chemicals that then led to these heart problems. So it wasn't so much the problem between animal and human models of research, The problem was you didn't have animals taking antibiotics when they were being studied, and so you didn't see these drug interactions. So you have to be careful not to conflate certain types of issues when you look at some of these statistics, and I was also a math major in college, and so I'm always careful in terms of looking at statistical issues. Next, past success need not create a warrant for current use. So just because something has been successful in the past and has provided important insights or gains, it doesn't necessarily mean we should use it now. We still have to ask the question now, is it ethical, even if it might have been ethical previously. So sometimes we see, even in Catholic Church doctrine, it's mentioned with someone beforehand that the Church's teaching on capital punishment has evolved, where the Church does not say capital punishment is inherently evil, has advocated for it in certain centuries, but in today's society we can say, no, we should never use capital punishment. Still does not say it's inherently wrong, but it says we should not use it today. We don't see any situations where it would be applicable. So just because something was used in the past and was understood as ethical doesn't necessarily mean we should use it now. So we have to be careful with the issue of prior success, meaning we should have a warrant for current use. Next, the abuse of something does not rule out use. So just about in anything we find abuses in science, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we should therefore rule out all types of scientific inquiry, certain types of scientific inquiry, just because, for example, we're not going to say we're not going to have surgeries because there are certain surgeons that come into surgery inebriated or something like that and abuse their privileges. So abuse does not necessarily mean that we don't use something. Next, there can be an inconsistent application of the concept of speciesism, where sometimes in speciesism we don't, the counter to speciesism is we don't want to make any distinctions between any of the species, from mice to humans, monkeys, whatever it might be. And yet at the same time, an argument's made, now wait a second, that monkeys are very close to humans, and so they have a special care that we have to have as opposed to mice. Well, then there's a speciesism between, not wanting it between monkeys and humans, but we might have it between mice and monkeys, or we might have it between mice and tapeworms, or something like that, if we're studying tapeworms. Then there could be the equivocation on the term of rights, and Rick, I would agree with you in terms of talking about the issue of rights, that sometimes it just muddles things, because when we say rights, we're talking about different things when we hear that word. Sometimes we can talk about God-given rights, sometimes we can talk about rights that come from human beings, etc. So that's an important thing. If we use the term rights, we need to make sure we're clear about what type of right we're talking about. And then finally, we have to be careful about avoiding anthropomorphizing animals. In other words, making animals seem like humans. We do that with our pets a lot. Those of you who are fans of The Far Side, Gary Larson, he doesn't publish anymore, unfortunately, but he had a great comic strip. And there's one where he has the owner of a dog talking to the dog. I think the dog's name is Ginger. And so the owner's going on and on and on, saying something to the dog, and then in the next frame it says, what Ginger hears, blah, 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 Ginger, blah, 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 Ginger. You know, that we think when we talk to our dogs that they're understanding everything we say. At least that's how I was when I died. So those are some things that we just have to be careful about. Now, how does the Church approach this in terms of theological backdrop? Creation is seen as good, and in fact, in terms of human beings, very good in the book of Genesis. But we have to note that animals predate humans, and were good apart from humans. So whether you look at it from the book of Genesis or from evolution, animals predate human beings, and were still good even before human beings existed. So they have their own ontological goodness, their own goodness of being, regardless of whether they're human beings around or not. Second, God's goodness is shown through the diversity of creation, and that value then comes from God. So St. Thomas of Aquinas says that, a fellow Dominican, who says that it is in the diversity of creation, the diversity of the animal, plant, see the greatness and goodness of God. Next, in the scriptures, certainly there is this understanding of human beings as the pinnacle of creation, because it says that human beings are made in the image and likeness of God, and they're therefore given dominion or stewardship over creation, including animals. So this is the distinction that's being made in the image and likeness of God that creates the moral distinction, if you would, between non-human animals and human beings. And yet, it's a careful distinction in that John Paul II said that the dominion granted to humanity by the Creator is not an absolute power, nor can one speak of a freedom to use and misuse or dispose of things as one pleases. So it's a limited type of dominion, or what we would term stewardship in the Catholic Church. And the obligations toward creation is not out of self-interest, but out of respect for the Creator, one who made creation. So that we don't care for the created world because somehow if we don't care for the created world, it's going to be bad for us. That's oftentimes what we talk about in terms of environmental ethics. But we do it because out of respect for the Creator who made the creation. So that's where that moral duty comes from, primarily. Now, there are a variety of uses of animals. In the scriptures, it seems that using animals as a means to an end is not seen as inherently wrong. Animals are used, for example, in sacrifice, etc., used for food. So there's not a specific edict in Scripture that says that the use of animals as a means to an end is problematic. And yet we know in the tradition of the Church and the lives of the saints, they had affections for animals. St. Francis, as most people know about, St. Philip Neri, who was a vegetarian who opposed the misuse of animals. St. Martin of Porres, a fellow Dominican who was known to be able to talk to the mice and the rats in Peru, in his convent or priory there. And he said, "Now, look, you have to stay out of the priory. People get upset if you come into the priory. I'll take care of feeding you outside. You stay out, I'll feed you." So supposedly he had the gift of talking to animals. He had the gift of tongues with rats, I suppose. And then saints like Thomas Aquinas argued against cruelty to animals from a consequentialist point of view, but against cruelty to animals because it might lead to cruelty towards human beings. And we actually know that in terms of some sort of amoral people, serial killers, etc., who start by being cruel to animals and then work their way up. So that's kind of the sort of scripture theological history. What are the particular applications to medical research in which we try to carry on the healing mission of Christ that Rick in some ways alluded to? What I've listed in your handout is the sections of the Catechism of the Catholic Church. I'm not going to read through all of those, but I just want to highlight a couple of things. In number 2415, it says, "Man's dominion over inanimate and other living beings granted by the Creator is not absolute. It is limited by concern for the quality of life of his neighbor, including generations to come. It requires a religious respect for the integrity of creation." And then in 2417, that's specifically on animal research, it says, "Medical and scientific experimentation on animals is a morally acceptable practice if it remains within reasonable limits and contributes to caring for or saving human lives." And then the next item, 2418, "It is contrary to human dignity, though, to cause animals to suffer or die needlessly." Now, there are a couple of things that are critical there. There are two catchphrases there. What are reasonable limits? So it says you can do it if it is within reasonable limits, and you can't cause animals to suffer or die needlessly. Now, what constitutes needlessly? So those are the types of things we have to discuss from an ethical point of view that require prudential judgment. The ethical argument, if you would, the translation from a theological or religious belief in terms of Scripture into the realm of ethics, is that human beings are different from animals because of will and intellect. In other words, they have the capacity, therefore, to be moral agents. So that this creates the ability for human beings to make these types of moral decisions that lead to what we would call basic human rights that animals would not have. And this is justification for animals to be used as a means to an end, because they can make claims on others, because they have this will of intellect, that animals can't do. So animals can't make these types of claims by themselves. And it's important to remember that this requirement is a capacity. So in other words, a human being need not have the actual ability at a given time in order to have rights. It's based on the nature that's there, not on the actual capacity. So that's, for example, why a person in a coma would still have the capacity to have rights not to be killed. Why? Because it's a radical capacity that's associated with the nature, even though they might not be exhibiting intellect and will at the time. Now, it's important though, and this is where I think Rick has an important insight, the lack of rights though does not mean there's no obligation in light of stewardship. So that we can maybe not talk about animal rights, but animal welfare, what's our responsibility. So you could still make the argument, even though there's no such thing as animal rights, you could still make the argument that there is an obligation not to use animals inappropriately or use them for research, even though they could not make the claim to a right to life like you could in terms of human beings. There is a development in terms of the notion of will and intellect that's moving towards human beings, if we think about it from an evolutionary standpoint or just scientific observation. And therefore, there's a greater obligation that occurs towards monkeys than there might be for mice from a Catholic viewpoint. Now, the application to the real world requires prudence, so that's where we get into what are the reasonable limits, what constitutes needless suffering. And so the Catholic Church would argue that there are some uses of animals in medical research that is acceptable, but there would have to be certain boundaries. First of all, that you try to minimize pain and distress in animals' experience. Generally it's pursued because of the cost of animals, etc. That researchers don't want to cause undue problems with their animals just because of the cost. And so tries to minimize this, but we know that there are abuses and there are certain situations where this happens because of the nature of the experiment. Second, we have to create strategies to reduce the number of animals needed, avoiding unnecessary duplication, with the appropriate concern for making sure that we do have replication in terms of research. There's not just one study that shows this, but you have to have replication in order to have verifiability. Making sure that research is worthwhile, with due regard to the legitimacy of crossover of data from animal to humans, recognizing, as Rick pointed out correctly, that there's a lot of things that where animal models, things seem all right, but in humans it's not all right, and vice versa. And finally, that there's an appropriate balance between human safety and animal harm, so that you don't necessarily just go right to human research, but at the same time recognizing you're still going to have to do human research in order to bring a drug to market. That's always going to have to happen, regardless of animal models or animal research. Third, the Church would recognize the importance of developing alternative methods to obtain the same quality data. So fMRIs, PET scans, induced pluripotent stem cells used in the future that may be valuable in terms of studies for toxicity and safety, although you still might, as a friend of mine said, she and I are both asthmatics, so she said, well, Pat, we're always going to have these animal models in order to check out lungs if you're doing asthma treatment, a drug for asthma. But as we move forward, the advances in technology have certainly reduced the need for the use of animals, and especially, I would say, maybe less so in medical research, but certainly in terms of medical education, that has changed drastically in the years since, even when I first started back teaching in medical school in 1991. And then fourth, the Catholic Church would argue there's a need for transparency and appropriate scrutiny through, Matt mentioned, the institutional animal care and use committees. Ultimately, from a Catholic perspective, the crux of the debate is not so much one about is it inherently wrong to use animals in research. That's not the question. The question is more the scientific debate, whether or not the very issues that Rick brought up in terms of does it provide or yield good data, and versus what Matt was saying in terms of what has been the value over the years in terms of helping in the scientific method and finding cures, and how much of that we will need in the future. So that would be a quick summary of Catholic teaching, and what we have is about 25 minutes or so where we can talk, 20-25 minutes to have some dialogue. We just invite Rick and Matt up.
In what was down in the state room today, they did talk about stem cell research and said that there have been such advances in stem cell research that it almost seems maybe it's archaic to do animal testing at this point, because you can isolate stem cells, you can, and I think that people like scientists and physicians that it is a better way of doing experiments and testing with one-to-one than probably the scientists in the
Okay, so let me repeat the question for people if they didn't hear it. Is that in the Wisconsin State Journal today there was a report about advances in terms of embryonic stem cells. Actually, it was about different ways of making it easier to culture them, grow them, that had been developed. And so the question is, part of what I went into towards the end, are certain techniques such as stem cell research, is that going to make animal research obsolete? I don't know, Matt, if you have any opinion on it, or Rick?
Well, I think that's actually something that's,
Just need to hold it up to you.
I think that's actually something that is, it's a really great question, and it's certainly one of the three R's that you look at as ways to basically replace animal research with, say, cell and tissue cultures, which is sort of the more general, I think, topic that you're bringing up when you bring up the use of stem cells. One of the flaws that I sort of alluded to, or the challenges, I guess, in using that technology, is that you lack the ability to see the way that those cells work vis-a-vis other tissues within the body. And so simply using cells in, say, a petri dish to study toxicity is an important first step, but you would need to also be able to understand what those cells would do in light of whatever it is that you've done to study it, that you're interested in looking at. It would be important to basically see what those cells are going to do in the whole animal. And so you can't simply eliminate animal research by using cell cultures, even with stem cells. You seem kind of perplexed though. Do you want to allow all of
Yeah, yes.
Maybe the follow-up would be if Rick was telling us that 92% of the studies are not accurate anyway. I'm just wondering if that's a great percentage of inaccuracy in stem cell research. I'm hoping would be more accurate.
So even if you were to accept Rick's claim, which I'm not sure that I would, you would then still have the difficulty of understanding the way that cell would work in the context of the whole animal itself. What type of cell you would say you would be using, or if you use, say, a pluripotent stem cell to study something, that still has enough important differences between what that, and I'll use a drug, that you use basically to study, evaluate a drug as an example. You would still basically be curious what would happen to that drug in the animal itself. Just placing that drug in the context of, in a petri dish with these stem cells isn't going to give you enough information to determine the safety of that drug or the efficacy of that drug. And also, I don't know if you want to maybe repeat the claim that was made, 92%. Can you do that off the top of your head?
Yeah, maybe that.
Well, I'd like to actually
Go back to that.
address that.
Okay. In 2004, the head of the Food and Drug Administration, which is the federal government's agency for regulating drug testing, gave a speech that relied on a published report that had determined that 92% of the drugs found to be safe and effective in non-human animals during drug testing are not safe and effective in people. So that's a claim specifically about the reliability of testing drugs in non-human animals. It's not a claim about stem cells or other kinds of experiments in animals. And it comes from the FDA, it's documented.
So how many of those? So when I basically have gone and studied under people that are work at Covance, for example, their motto is that they kill bad drugs. And I guess the argument that you were then making is that they miss a lot of those bad drugs, right? But they're still able. Well, now, was that basically in terms of efficacy, in terms of safety?
Both. And the head of the FDA said at the time also in the speech that he gave that afterwards, when those 8% of drugs found to be safe and effective in both non-human animals and humans actually get to market, because they passed human testing also, half of them were later withdrawn from market because it turns out that after all they're not safe and effective, or at least not safe enough for people. So the bottom line was 4% of the drugs found to be safe and effective in non-human animals actually get to market and are sold and continue to be considered safe and effective for people. When I say 4%, boy, you know, if we knew a weather forecaster who was right 4% of the time, we'd never tune into them. But that's what our system is relying on for drug testing.
So then, Mr. Marolt, how would you go about setting up a system that would evaluate drugs?
I'm not at all qualified to answer that question.
But you are qualified to basically strike down what the system that's currently set up is.
I'm very qualified to read a report from the Food and Drug Administration and share it with the audience.
You know, one of the things that I would say in terms of this is, I mean, part of it is, you know, always to look at, and unfortunately I don't have to report, to look at what it said and what it was trying to get at. You know, in terms of, I mean, as I say, sometimes what happens is the reason why drugs are safe in animals, but they end up not being safe in humans is because there are other systems that are involved here. If you're on another type of drug or something like that there can be interactions, etc. So you'd have to look at some of those statistics. But I think the broader question is that probably the advent of, and people that are involved in stem cell research will say, one of the importances of embryonic stem cell research or induced pluripotent stem cells. You know, the Catholic Church would be in favor of one and not of the other, but which is a whole separate topic than what we're doing tonight. But that there probably are some ways that embryonic stem cells or other stem cell lines will be important in terms of evaluating certain issues of toxicity. So it probably will be helpful in some ways, but it may not solve the overall problem. Once you, let us say, you find it safe with a stem cell line, you still have to see, is it going to be efficacious? So it might test for toxicity, but you don't know if it's going to be efficacious in terms of, say, working in lungs, say, to treat asthma or something like that, because you're probably not going to be able to develop a lung, you know, with, you know, that exists outside itself, you know, by itself, without being connected to everything else. So that it's hard to do the testing for efficacy. You might be able to do some toxicity safety tests, but you're probably still, so I would say probably there would be areas where it would be helpful and maybe reduce the amount of animal research, but it won't obviate the need for it. Yeah.
Can I respond to a couple points there?
Yeah, sure.
Let's see, quickly then. I'm no expert on stem cells. Dr. Rick Marolt has co-authored 4 books on the history of experiments on non-human animals, and has come to the conclusion that there are 9 ways in which experimenting on non-human animals can, at least in theory, benefit people. And he says that we've got benefits on 7 of them. I'm not here saying that no benefits coming out of experiments on non-human animals, but his research has shown that relying on non-human animals as models for testing human drug candidates is very unreliable, and that relying on non-human animals as models of human disease is very unreliable. Stem cells, I can imagine, actually could fall into that other category of helping people if we experiment on stem cells in non-human animals. That's quite possible, because we want to use stem cells to grow tissue, to grow organs, and we're going to do that first in petri dishes, and then we're going to do it in animals. And we'll probably learn something from it. So I cringe every time I see a news report like you saw this morning in the State Journal, because the promise is just fantastic with stem cells. but it also means there's going to be more animals used. Jamie Thompson himself, who was the first to isolate iPS cells, has asked for, he's made an argument for more animals to be used in testing stem cells. Real quickly, the other point, please keep in mind when I talk about this stuff, I'm calling into question the claim, the utilitarian claim about costs and benefits, because we need to be skeptical of that and get to data, get to evidence, read reports, and know what we're talking about. But my position is, even if testing drugs in non-human animals or using non-human animals in models of disease was highly reliable, I would find it unethical, and for the same reason I'd find doing those things on people would be unethical.
Yeah.
I have a question for Matt, which is, in the course of your work, have you come to the conclusion that you've seen animals used unethically at the UW in the course of your career there? And if you have, could you please tell us what the circumstances were that led you to that conclusion? And then the third step is, what, if anything, did you do?
So that's a fascinating
Let me repeat the question. So she asked if Matt had ever seen any unethical use of
What he believed.
What he believed to be unethical use of animals or treatment of animals at UW.
No, in his lab.
In his lab
his career.
In his career. And
what were the circumstances that led him to that conclusion?
And what, if anything, we do. I don't know if you want to comment about specific UW cases or anything like that.
Yeah, I am really not at liberty to basically comment on anything in that regard. So,
well, let's ask a different question. Have you ever, in your professional career, seen laboratory animals used in the way you believe was unethical? And if you could just broadly describe what the circumstances were when you were the witness to it, and just very broadly and generally describe what, if anything, you did do in response to that.
Maybe the broader question, maybe to make it less personal to ask you, Matt, is what are the types of abuses that veterinarians commonly see? And what are the types of abuse that they commonly see? Maybe, so it takes it out of this context, if you would, but maybe I'll let you give a more detailed description. What are the types of things?
I can talk about some of the kinds of things that the regulations that we basically enforce are interested in. They're particularly interested in, maybe to cite one example, the Animal Welfare Act is particularly concerned that dogs, they're particularly concerned that dogs get a certain amount of exercise and things like that. That animals are allowed to exhibit a plurality of their normal ethogram, or the behaviors that they would exhibit. And you can talk about things like cage sizes and things of that nature. And I think that's an example of the kinds of things that, as a veterinarian, I have to take a particular concern for and in. We also have to minimize the spread of disease that would occur in any sort of group of animals or population of animals.
You know, I would just say one of the things that I've talked to some of my scientific friends in terms of what they've said, and that oftentimes it's been associated with where animals have not had appropriate anesthesia, and they were used in a way that caused needless suffering to the animals. And this is, I have a friend in another state who had this example, and she actually quit the lab that she was working in because of the way the researcher was doing things. So now, I don't know enough details about whether she went to a particular committee, because we didn't get into details about that. But I think that's one of the things that still happens, is that oftentimes there's not enough anesthesia used and animals undergo needless pain in terms of procedures. So I think we would think that's not there, but yet it still is there. I think a lot of times we think about they're in crowded cages, et cetera, but there's still a lack of anesthesia, et cetera.
Well, that kind of suggests that there's not a very adequate remedial system in place so that people can speak up and not have to put their own careers on the line and say, gee, well, now I've got to quit.
Well, if I could make a comment basically off of that, most of the times, there have been very, very few times when I would say that animals haven't been given anesthesia or anesthesia that's appropriate. Those few times are basically, as I mentioned in my talk, when that actually interferes with what is being studied. And so the IAPIC is kind of aware of that. And so, that would be an example. And that goes on where basically lab animal veterinarians play a very important role.
Father Pat, if I may, there's the hands been up in the back. Oh, go ahead. No, yours.
This is a question related back to your comments about 2004, and I guess maybe to help understand is to flip the question around and say, of all the drugs that are effective in humans now, that we know are safe and effective, how many of those drugs went through animal research to get to where they are now? So it's kind of an opposite look to what you guys were discussing before.
It's a great question, but the answer is not going to be very illuminating because the FDA, I said, is the federal agency that oversees drug testing. The FDA requires all human drug candidates to be tested on 2 species of non-human animals. So, as a matter of federal regulation, every human drug has been tested on animals. But that says nothing about whether that testing was reliable or worth doing.
Carol?
In looking at the sections from the Catechism,
Mm-hmm.
there's a definite emphasis on weighing the benefits against the cost to animals. But I'm wondering how that happens in practice, because it seems to me that some of the research that's being done is very basic research that, my sister was a researcher, and so I was always saying, so what disease are you curing? And she was always trying to explain to me that what she was doing was just a basic understanding of how molecules worked or how cells worked. And so how do you do that weighing if the research is sufficiently basic that it's not clear what the ultimate impact on humans is going to be?
So Kara's question is the issue of what we'd call almost like bench science, where you're doing science that doesn't have necessarily an immediate clinical application. And how would a Catholic approach based on the catechism burdens and benefits deal with that question, given the fact that you don't see immediate clinical benefit? So that's a wonderful question. And you're right, the catechism is indicating that in distinction from what Rick was talking about, it doesn't see the research on animals as being intrinsically evil or inherently evil, because again, this distinction about image and likeness of God in human beings, and theologically we talk about one having an immortal soul and animals not having an immortal soul, but having a sensitive soul or a mortal soul. So because of that, it allows for this burden-benefit calculus, therefore. Now you raise an important question, and that gets more into the scientific issue of the need for bench science that does provide information that cross-fertilizes with a lot of other areas. So oftentimes the thing that you're working on oftentimes allows for assistance in other areas of research. So there's this cross-fertilization that occurs. And that's necessary in terms of, as a foundational building block in terms of science, even though it doesn't have immediate clinical applicability. Now, of course, in research these days, because of the scarcity of funds, especially in terms of government funding, oftentimes you're trying to show immediate clinical applicability. Because then you're going to be more likely to get funding, and that's a big debate in terms of the scientific world about how much bench science do you need to fund. That's just getting at building block issues versus the applications several steps down the road. And at least my perspective as a scientist, I think Matt can also speak to it, is you need both. You have to have both. The difficulty that you're raising is that whole issue of what constitutes needless. That you're going to have some suffering or death of animals for some things that may seem very irrelevant to human health or saving human lives. And that's where I would say the gift of prudence comes in, and in terms of making that decision, knowing how prudence allows you to apply norms in the concrete, and therefore a lot of that is based on experience, I would say. So that you have to look at bench science has allowed for clinical application down the road, and to say, is this needless or worthless or extraneous research that really is using animals inappropriately, or is this something that's going to really provide a foundation for us that will allow for clinical advances in the future? Like I did a lot of, when I was a scientist, I did more bench science type of things, rather than the clinical types of things. So I'd let Matt maybe speak to that a little bit too, in terms of his view.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and there is no easy answer. I think you basically have to weigh, and it's in the best judgment of the IAPA as to the level of science that's going to be provided, and also the level of discomfort that would be given to the animal. Most of the time, in my experience with those kind of more basic experiments, the level of discomfort is minimal. And so I think you have to that's basically simply put the way that it would go about and be done practically. Is the IAPA would basically review the protocol and say, okay, what is the science that's at stake here? How is this going to connect up with other kinds of interesting ideas? To echo basically what Father Pat said. And then they would also examine what the level, what's being asked of the animal, and weigh both of those in making their decision as far as whether or not to approve the protocol.
It's interesting that we've been talking about experiments in animals for, how long is it? An hour or 15 minutes or so? And I don't think that we've talked about any examples of it. It's like we're having this academic discussion without really talking about what happened. And this is a question that gives us an opportunity to talk about it. Here's one example. First thing that comes to mind. There are researchers at UW-Madison who want to know the role of a brain organ in the brain's processing of fear, the fear response, how we respond psychologically to scary things. And so they opened the skulls of some monkeys and they destroyed two organs called the amygdalas, which are known to be the emotional centers, or some of the emotional centers of the primate brain. And they then compare how monkeys with normal intact brains, normal healthy amygdalas, respond to scary things, and how monkeys with destroyed amygdalas respond to scary things. That's basic science. That's the role of an organ in a physical or psychological process. Right? So before that happens, the researcher has to come forward, an ICOC or ACOC, they're sometimes called, and get approval for this protocol and have an agreement on how the experiments may be done. And UW-Madison says that at that point there is discussion about costs and benefits, and they only approve experiments where the benefits will exceed the costs. And I have your question. How can they do that? How do they know that? How do they know when or if, knowing a little bit more about the role of the amygdala and the primate brain's processing of fear is ever going to benefit humans? They can't possibly know that. So I've pressed them a little bit on this. I say, can you show me examples of protocols that were rejected because you didn't think that the benefits would exceed the costs? No, they don't have those. I ask, can you show me your calculations? How do you calculate costs and benefits so that you compare them? They said they have no method for doing that. I say, okay, it's basic science. You only know this after the fact anyway. Have you looked back in time and seen research that was done 10, 20 years ago? How was that benefiting people? I mean, that should be a matter of empirical evidence at this point. No, as far as I know, that no analysis like that has ever been done. Well, you make the claim that the research is ethical because it meets the utilitarian standard of maximizing the ratio of benefits to costs, and there is literally no data about benefits and costs. And yet that's the kind of work they've done with that justification, destroying emotional centers and monkey brains.
Yeah, if I might just further, I mean, this is one of the central conflicts in ethics, is this, what basically comes down to qualitative assessments of burdens and benefits as opposed to quantitative assessments. And it's very hard to get a quantitative assessment when you're trying to compare the suffering that's involved in the animal, the pain that the animal experiences, versus this type of benefit to the human being that may or may not occur. So that becomes very problematic in terms of trying to come up with any type of qualitative or quantitative sense that it's mostly qualitative. Now, the only thing, and that's where the virtue of prudence comes in from the Catholic standpoint of trying to make a good decision in light of that. But it is very difficult. At the same time, we have to realize that most of our decisions in life are qualitative assessments as opposed to quantitative. So when a person gets married to this person, they don't say, well, he's a good cook, 5 points, he's got a good sense of humor, 3 points, he throws his clothes on the floor, -6 points, he's a Dallas Cowboy fan like Father Pat, -10 points, you know, so, well, that was a negative sum, so I'm not going to marry the person. So,
Did my wife share her scorecard with you?
Pardon me?
Did my wife share her scorecard with you?
No. But in any case, that's, so that oftentimes we make a lot of our decisions non-quantitatively, that we make it on a qualitative basis through a lot of different things, but in things that are, and it's not to say we don't make serious decisions either. The decision about who you marry is one of the most serious decisions we make in life, and we do it mainly on a qualitative basis. But I think Rick's point is well taken in that sometimes we make assertions that when pushed, and I'm an analytical type myself, when pushed, well, how do you know that? You don't always get a precise answer, a quantitative answer that you'd like to have.
I'm just going to be the heretic that I am and say that I get very frustrated in these conversations. It's one of the reasons I lost interest in religion, is that I feel that religion has been designed by man to rationalize man's behavior, which is destroying our planet. And I want to say that I listened to a talk by Carolyn Rassette, who's a professor at UC Berkeley, and she said we are emerging from 400 years of this Descartesian, utilitarian, confined space paradigm that is destroying our Earth. And then rationalizing this kind of atrocity to other living beings who are here to enjoy this Earth in their short lifetime really aggravates me that religion would even entertain that possibility as any validity, having any validity at all, at any point, for any reason. Because I see that we are destroying our nest. I don't put us in some hierarchy where we are the image of God and everything else is not. I say we are all one, and that is something that religion has often taught. In many religions, all of life is one. And what we do to others, we do to ourselves. And there is right now, to balance the human rights edict, a declaration of the rights of Mother Earth and all beings that says all beings have the right to exist, not be harmed by humans, and live in their natural habitat and create their natural role in the ecosystem. And I still hear in this room purely a utilitarian argument and not an ethical argument.
Yeah, let me just say, well, a couple of things, is that, I mean, many religions actually reject the Cartesian notion. So Descartes just believed that you could use animals indiscriminately. So because of this difference between human beings and animals, and so I would say probably most religions actually don't take a Cartesian approach. The Catholic Church certainly doesn't take a Cartesian approach to it. It's a much more nuanced approach. But what it comes down to is really this question of is there an understanding, whether it's intuitively or rationally, that there is a sufficient distinction between humans and non-human animals that justifies certain practices, whether it's using animals for food, whether it's having them for pets, I mean, all those different things, so that if, you would really have to say, sort of a logical extension, if you would, in terms of what I call a nature approach, a oneness in nature, that you would really have to say no pets, no zoos, no circuses, none of them, no, so that would be, and that's the position that's out there. I think there are others that would make a distinction between, not a Cartesian distinction, but a distinction made in terms of experience about the difference between human beings and animals that that's based in scripture, that's based in a lot of different religions that would talk about dominion or stewardship over animals. So, and I guess that's a legitimate debate. I think both things are out there.
Why is difference hierarchy? Why is difference hierarchy?
So why is difference hierarchy? Well, I think it's because it's not difference that creates hierarchy, it's the type of difference that creates hierarchy. Especially I want to thank Matt and Rick for offering their comments tonight and their thoughts. Obviously, it's a difficult subject, and it's one that I'm very appreciative that you came out and we had a good dialogue about, and a way to ask some important questions. And I think ultimately, in terms of this, I think Rick is very much on point in that the ultimate question that comes down to it is not necessarily, or at least the first question that we certainly have to answer before we get into any type of consequentialist or utilitarian calculus, if you would, is the fundamental question about whether doing research on animals or per se is allowable, where you cause suffering, etc., whether that in itself, because if it is wrong, then no matter what good that comes out of it, the ends simply don't justify the means.